Everyone thought these 5 boys were a curse to this elderly woman, but they didn't know the secret oath they took 30 years ago. When 5 matching white luxury SUVs suddenly surrounded her wheelchair in the middle of this dusty street, the neighborhood prepared for a tragedy. But they were about to witness a miracle that would put every millionaire to shame. Stay tuned, because what they carried inside those cars will change the way you look at homeless people forever. The sun in this forgotten corner of the world doesn't just shine, it punishes. It beats down on the dry, cracked earth of the urban outskirts, casting long, jagged shadows against buildings that look like they are holding onto their last breath. This is where our story begins, not in a palace, not in a boardroom, but in the dust. Specifically, in front of a pale, weathered structure with a fading sign that reads Care Center. To any passerby, this building was a ruin, a skeleton of bricks and broken dreams. But to Kadadiatu Kulibali, it was a sanctuary. Kadadiatu was a woman whose face was a living map of 1,000 untold stories. Her skin, a deep, rich ebony, was lined with the scars of 1,000 struggles. Her hair had long since turned to a dignified silver gray, tucked neatly away, while her eyes held a spark that even poverty couldn't extinguish. She was a woman who had seen empires rise and fall, but her focus was always on the invisible ones, the ones the world preferred to step over rather than help. In the late 1990s, these streets were teeming with unwanted children. These were the boys who slept on jagged pieces of corrugated metal, who washed their faces in muddy puddles, and who learned to silence the screaming pain of hunger with the numbness of sleep. Most people walked past them, pulling their coats tighter or clutching their bags closer, fearing the trash of the city. But Kadadiatu was different. She didn't have money. She barely had enough to keep her own wheelchair moving. Yet, she possessed a wealth of spirit that no bank could ever quantify. One by one, she found them. The first was a boy no older than 6, huddled behind a cacra bin, shivering despite the midday heat. She didn't ask for his name, she asked if he was hungry. When he didn't answer, she simply reached out her hand, a hand that would later be kissed by millionaires, though she didn't know it then. Within a year, 5 boys were living under her wing. They weren't related by blood, but they were bound by the shared trauma of the streets. They were the 5 homeless boys. The neighborhood called them a curse and a burden. People would shout at Kadadiatu from their balconies, "You can't even feed yourself. Why are you bringing more stray dogs into this alley?" She would simply bow her head, much like she does today in her black wheelchair, and whisper a prayer. She taught those boys something the streets never could: dignity. She taught them that being homeless was a temporary condition of the wallet, not a permanent condition of the soul. Part 1 sets the stage for the most shocking part of the story. You see, Kadadiatu didn't just give them a roof, she gave them a why. She told them, "The world sees you as dirt, but remember, dirt is where the strongest trees grow. You must grow so tall that the people who once looked down on you will have to strain their necks just to see your faces." The conditions were dire beyond imagination. They shared a single, cramped room where the air smelled of damp earth and old dreams. Sometimes, for dinner, they would boil a pot of water with a few stolen herbs just to make their stomachs feel heavy, so they could trick themselves into falling asleep. There were nights when the rain leaked through the pale yellow ceiling of the care center, and Kadadiatu would stay awake, moving her wheelchair from corner to corner to make sure the boys stayed dry, even as she herself was soaked to the bone. She sacrificed her health. She sacrificed her comfort. Every gray hair on her head was a receipt for a meal she gave up so they could have a single bite. She was building a foundation of loyalty that would last 30 long years. But as the boys reached their teenage years, the harsh reality of the streets began to clash with their growing dreams of success. They realized that as long as they stayed in that dusty urban area, they would only ever be the homeless boys in the eyes of society. They saw their mother, their savior, growing weaker. Her legs, which used to walk miles to find them scraps, were now failing her completely. She was becoming a permanent prisoner of that black wheelchair. The boys knew that a thank you wasn't enough. A hug wasn't enough. They needed to do something shocking. They needed to change the trajectory of their lives so they could rebuild hers. And so, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, the eldest boy sat at the feet of Kadadiatu. He didn't look at her as a beggar looks at a benefactor. He looked at her as a soldier looks at his queen. He whispered the words that would trigger a 30-year journey. "Mother, the streets have taught us how to survive. Now, let us go and learn how to rule." Kadadiatu wept, not because she was losing her help, but because she knew the world was cruel to boys who came from nothing. But she let them go. She gave them her last $10, a bill she had hidden inside her shoe for a life-and-death emergency, and her final blessing. As they walked away, 5 scruffy figures disappearing into the hazy, shimmering horizon of the city, the neighbors laughed. "They're gone," they sneered. "They took your last cent and they'll never look back. Who would return to this dump?" Kadadiatu didn't argue. She just sat back in her wheelchair, bowed her head, and began the long 30-year wait. Little did the neighbors know, those boys weren't running away from the care center. They were running toward a promise. A promise that would eventually involve 5 white SUVs, 5 dark suits, and a return that would stun the entire world. The dust from their departing footsteps hadn't even settled before the whispers began. In that small, crumbling corner of the city, news traveled faster than the wind, and the news was grim. Kadadiatu's boys were gone. The neighborhood didn't see it as a brave journey. They saw it as a betrayal. "She wasted 30 years of her life on trash," they said, loud enough for her to hear. "She gave them her last $10, and they didn't even look back once." But Kadadiatu sat in her black wheelchair, her head slightly bowed, her hands folded in her lap, a posture of silent, unshakable faith. She knew what the world didn't, that love is an investment that sometimes takes decades to mature. The first year was a test of survival. The boys were now in the heart of the great concrete jungle, hundreds of miles away. They were 5 shadows in a city of millions. They slept in bus stations. They washed in public fountains. They ate leftovers from restaurant bins. But they had a secret weapon that no other homeless person had, a vow. They had looked into the eyes of a woman who sacrificed her legs for them, and they realized they could not afford to fail. Failure wasn't just about them. Failure meant Kadadiatu would die in that rundown care center, alone and forgotten. The struggle was invisible to the world. Every night, the 5 brothers would meet under a single flickering street lamp to count their coins. There were nights when the eldest, whose face was already hardening with the weight of responsibility, would go without water just so the youngest could have a piece of bread. They worked the jobs no one else wanted. They cleaned sewers. They hauled bricks until their fingernails bled. They guarded warehouses in the freezing cold. But every time their bodies screamed to give up, they remembered the pale yellow walls of the care center and the sound of Kadadiatu's wheelchair. Back in the village, the years began to bleed into decades. The 30-year silence was the hardest part. Imagine the psychological torture of waiting for a letter that never arrives. 10 years passed, then 15, then 20. The care center's exterior grew even more weathered, the beige paint peeling away like old skin. Kadadiatu's hair turned from salt and pepper to a pure, snowy white. She was now a permanent fixture of that dusty street, a living ghost of a mother. People stopped mocking her and started pitying her, which was worse. They would drop a few coins in her lap, thinking she was just another beggar, not realizing she was the mother of kings in waiting. But why the silence? Why didn't they call? Why didn't they send a message? This is the shocking truth the audience needs to understand. The boys had decided that a small success was a dangerous thing. They knew that if they sent home $100, it would be spent on food, and the cycle of poverty would continue. They didn't want to buy her a meal. they wanted to buy her a kingdom. They had disappeared into the world of international trade, shipping, and real estate, moving from the streets to the boardrooms. They were building an empire in silence, working 18 hours a day, living in cramped apartments even when they started making millions, just to save every single cent for the great return. Every time they felt the temptation to reach out, they stopped themselves. They wanted the impact to be so massive, so shocking, that it would erase 30 years of suffering in a single afternoon. They were waiting for the perfect moment, the moment when their success was so undeniable that the people who mocked Kadadiatu would be forced to bow their heads in shame. They were tracking her from afar, hearing silent guardians to watch over her without her knowing, ensuring she was safe, but allowing the world to think she was abandoned. As the 30th year approached, the tension reached a breaking point. Kadadiatu was now very frail. Her head bowed lower, her grip on her wheelchair weakened. The direct sunlight of the dry urban area seemed to be fatting for her. The neighbors started saying she wouldn't last another winter. "What a tragedy," they whispered. "To die waiting for sons who never existed." Even the care center seemed ready to collapse. The sign was hanging by a single rusted nail. The world had written her off. But thousands of miles away, in a high-rise office made of glass and steel, 5 men stood in front of a window. They weren't wearing rags anymore. They were wearing dark, custom-tailored suits. Their white shirts were crisp. Their watches were worth more than the entire neighborhood they grew up in. They looked at a calendar and then at each other. The eldest brother spoke, his voice thick with 30 years of repressed emotion. "It is time. The white motorcade is ready. Let us go home and show them who we are." The stage was set. The 30-year silence was about to be broken by the roar of engines. The woman who had been called a fool was about to become the most envied mother on the planet. But she didn't know it yet. She was just sitting there in the dust, holding her breath, waiting for a miracle that everyone else had given up on. While the 5 boys were transforming into titans of industry in distant lands, the world they left behind was rotting. The street where the care center stood had become a graveyard of broken hopes. The beige paint on the walls had been sandblasted by 30 years of dust, leaving the building looking like a skeletal remains of a life once lived. Kadadiatu, now a ghost of her former self, remained the only constant. She was the woman in the black wheelchair, a permanent fixture under the scorching, direct sunlight. To the new generation of the neighborhood, she was a myth, a cautionary tale. Parents would point at her and whisper to their children, "Look at her. She gave everything to children who weren't hers, and look where it got her. Loneliness is the only reward for a fool's kindness." Kadadiatu heard it all. Every insult, every sympathetic sigh, every mocking laugh. But she didn't look up. She kept her head bowed, her hands resting on a lap that hadn't felt the weight of a child in 3 decades. The physical toll was devastating. Her wheelchair was rusted, the wheels squeaking with every inch she moved. The light-colored top she wore was thin from years of washing, and her dark skirt was frayed at the edges. But if you looked closely at her face, the face of a woman who had survived the unthinkable, you wouldn't see regret. You would see a terrifyingly calm patience. She wasn't just waiting, she was manifesting a promise made in the dirt 30 years ago. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the shocking success was being finalized. The 5 brothers were no longer just survivors. They were architects of a new reality. They didn't spend their millions on flashy parties or fleeting fame. Every investment, every boardroom battle, every late-night merger was done with one image in mind: the rundown care center. They were living in a success that felt hollow because the person who deserved it most was still sitting in the streets. The eldest brother, now a man of immense power, stood in a glass-walled office overlooking a city that once tried to swallow him whole. He looked at his 4 brothers, men who had grown from scruffy orphans into sharp, sophisticated leaders. They didn't need to speak. They began the secret journey. They didn't fly back with a press release or a public announcement. They wanted the neighborhood to feel the shock. They ordered 5 identical white Toyota Land Cruisers, not because they liked the color, but because white symbolized the purity of the debt they were paying back. They tailored 5 matching dark suits, symbolizing the unity of the brothers who never broke their bond. In the village, the air grew thick with a strange tension. A week before the arrival, mysterious men began appearing in the neighborhood, quietly buying up the surrounding plots of land. People thought it was the government or a faceless corporation. No one suspected the homeless boys. Kadadiatu sat in her wheelchair, feeling a change in the wind. Her heart, though old and tired, began to beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt since the morning they left. The neighbors saw her smiling at the horizon and laughed. "The old woman has finally lost her mind," they sneered. "She's smiling at the dust." But Kadadiatu wasn't smiling at the dust. She was smiling at the sound of 5 engines roaring across the desert, carrying her reward. The silence of 30 years was about to be broken by a thunder that would shake the very foundations of that beige building. The preparation was complete. The suits were pressed. The white SUVs were fueled. The 5 homeless boys were gone, and in their place were 5 kings. They were about to step out into the dirt and show the world that the streets don't define you, the return does. The morning of the return began like any other in that parched, dusty neighborhood. The sun hung heavy in the sky, a golden eye watching the care center as it stood in its quiet, beige misery. Kadadiatu was in her usual spot. Her black wheelchair was parked on the edge of the dirt road, her head bowed as she sat in a trance-like state of prayer. To the world, she was a statue of failure. To the neighbors, she was a reminder of why you should never give your heart to the unwanted. But at exactly 11:15 a.m., the vibration started. It wasn't a sound at first, it was a feeling, a low hum that resonated in the soles of the neighbors' feet. People stopped what they were doing. Shopkeepers stepped onto the sidewalk. Children stopped playing in the dirt. Then, from the horizon, a cloud of dust began to rise, a massive, swirling golden pillar that signaled the approach of something powerful. Then came the flash of white. Through the haze of the dry urban area, the first white Toyota Land Cruiser appeared. It was followed by a second, then a third, a fourth, and finally a fifth. 5 pristine, identical white SUVs, their polished paint reflecting the direct sunlight like diamonds. They didn't slow down for the potholes. They moved with the authority of a presidential motorcade. The contrast was violent, luxury vehicles that cost more than the entire street, driving through the heart of the streets. The world stopped spinning. The motorcade pulled up directly in front of the weathered, pale yellow building. The engines hummed with a deep, expensive purr, then simultaneously fell silent. The dust settled, coating everything in a fine layer of grit, but the white SUVs remained blindingly bright. The neighbors watched, paralyzed with fear and curiosity. "Is it the government?" someone whispered. "Are they here to finally tear down the care center?" Kadadiatu did not move. She kept her head bowed, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't need to look. She knew the smell of the air had changed. The air no longer smelled of poverty, it smelled of victory. Then the doors opened. From each of the 5 cars, a man stepped out. These were the 5 homeless boys. But the boys were gone. In their place stood 5 powerful African men, dressed in matching, razor-sharp dark suits and crisp white shirts. Their posture was regal, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, their presence commanding an instant, terrifying respect. The neighbors who had spent 30 years mocking Kadadiatu suddenly found they couldn't breathe. They recognized the faces. They saw the jawlines of the boys they had chased away, the eyes of the orphans they had called trash. But the power radiating from these men was so immense that no one dared to speak. The moment of truth. The 5 men didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at the expensive cars. They only had eyes for the woman in the black wheelchair. As if moved by a single soul, the 5 brothers walked toward her. Their leather shoes crunched on the dry earth, the same earth where they once begged for scraps. When they reached her, they didn't just stand there to show off their wealth. They did something that broke the heart of every person watching. All 5 millionaire businessmen, kings of their own industries, dropped to their knees in the dirt. They knelt in front of the wheelchair, their expensive suits soaking up the dust of the streets. The eldest brother reached out and gently took Kadadiatu's weathered, shaking hands in his. He didn't say a word about his money, his cars, or his power. He simply bowed his head against her lap and wept. The shocking return was complete. The streets had been conquered by success, but the success had come back to bow to the streets. This was the image from your thumbnail, the 5 kings in the dirt, the white SUVs in the background, and a mother who had finally seen her prayers take human form. The silence of 30 years wasn't just broken. It was shattered by a display of loyalty that the world would never forget. The image of 5 billionaires kneeling in the dirt was enough to freeze time, but the shocking part of this return was only just beginning. As the neighbors watched with tears of shame and awe, the eldest brother stood up and signaled toward the line of white SUVs. This wasn't just a homecoming. It was a military-grade operation of restoration. The trunks of the luxury vehicles were opened, but they weren't filled with luggage or personal belongings. Instead, a team of professional assistants in matching uniforms began to unload stacks of legal documents, architectural blueprints, and high-tech medical crates. The crowd gasped as a man in a formal gray suit, the brothers' chief legal counsel, stepped forward with a gold-trimmed leather briefcase. The eldest brother took a document from the briefcase and turned toward the crowd. His voice, amplified by the stunned silence of the street, echoed against the pale yellow walls of the care center. "For 30 years, he began, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had mocked his mother, you called this building a ruin. You called the woman inside a fool. You treated this street like a graveyard for the forgotten." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Today, that ends. As of 8:00 a.m. this morning, we have officially purchased every square inch of this block. The care center, the shops, the land beneath your feet, it all belongs to the Kadadiatu Foundation." The neighborhood was paralyzed. In one single legal stroke, the homeless boys had become the landlords of their oppressors. But they didn't come for revenge, they came for success. They rolled out a massive architectural blueprint right there in the dust, pinning it to the side of one of the white Land Cruisers. It showed a vision of the future that looked like a dream. The care center wasn't being torn down. It was being encased in glass and steel, preserved as a monument of love, while a multi-million-dollar medical facility and a vocational school were to be built around it. "We didn't come back to buy ourselves mansions," the youngest brother added, his voice trembling with emotion. "We came back to ensure that no mother on this street ever has to choose between her own meal and the life of an orphan. We came back to turn these streets into a sanctuary." Then came the most emotional moment. The brothers approached Kadadiatu, who was still sitting in her black wheelchair, her eyes wide with a joy that words couldn't capture. They didn't just give her money, they gave her a key. A solid gold key to a custom-built, medical-grade villa they had constructed in secret just a few miles away, a place where she would have 24-hour nursing care, every luxury imaginable, and most importantly, a room for each of her 5 sons. But Kadadiatu shook her head. She pointed to the old, weathered building behind her. Through her tears, she whispered her first words of the day. "My heart is here. My sons are here. This is where the miracle happened." The brothers understood. They didn't force her into a palace. They realized that her success was the streets themselves. They announced right then and there that the white SUVs would remain in the village, converted into a 24/7 emergency transport fleet for the elderly and the sick, completely free of charge. The shocking return wasn't about showing off their wealth. It was about the total redistribution of that wealth to the place that gave them a chance when they were nothing. The neighbors who once threw stones now stood in line to apologize. The 5 homeless boys had returned as 5 kings, but their first act as rulers was to wash the feet of the woman who saved them and promise a future where homeless was a word only found in history books. The beige building, once a symbol of decay, was now the headquarters of a global empire of kindness. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows of the 5 white SUVs across the dusty road, the atmosphere of the neighborhood underwent a spiritual transformation. The shocking return wasn't just a 15-minute event, it was a total takeover. The 5 brothers didn't just arrive and leave, they stayed. They occupied the street that had once rejected them, but they didn't do it with anger. They did it with an overwhelming display of grace. The Feast of the Forgotten. By 6:00 p.m., the streets looked like a scene from a royal gala. From the back of the luxury SUVs, crates upon crates of the finest food and supplies were unloaded. The brothers had arranged for a world-class catering team to follow them in secret, and suddenly, long tables covered in white linen were being set up right in front of the weathered beige building. The aroma of rich spices, roasted meats, and fresh bread filled the air, sense that this neighborhood had only ever experienced in dreams. The eldest brother stood at the head of the table, but he refused to sit until every elderly person and every orphan in the district was seated first. "Today," he announced, his voice carrying through the cool evening air, "no one on this street goes to sleep hungry. Not tonight, not tomorrow, and not as long as we breathe." This was the success they had fought for, not the cars, not the suits, but the power to erase hunger from the place where they once starved. Then came the moment that gave the part its name. As darkness fell, the brothers signaled for a switch to be thrown. They had brought in industrial generators and a team of electricians. Suddenly, the care center, which had spent decades in the dark with flickering candles or no light at all, was bathed in a brilliant, blinding white light. Thousands of LED strings and powerful floodlights illuminated the pale yellow walls, making the old building glow like a lighthouse in the middle of a dark sea. For the first time in 30 years, Kadadiatu could see the faces of her sons clearly in the night. She sat in her black wheelchair, now draped in a soft, silk pashmina the youngest brother had brought from Italy. She watched as the neighbors, people who had spent decades sneering at her, approached the table with tears in their eyes. They weren't just coming for the food, they were coming for forgiveness. The confession. One by one, the elders of the neighborhood approached Kadadiatu. A man who had once refused to give the boys a glass of water knelt before her wheelchair. "We were blind," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We saw 5 beggars, but you saw 5 stars. We mocked your kindness, but today your kindness is the only thing saving us." Kadadiatu didn't say a word of reproach. She simply touched his hand and pointed to her sons. "I didn't do it for the reward," she said softly. "I did it because they were humans, and humans, when loved, become heroes." As the celebration continued, the brothers shared the how of their journey. They revealed that even during the 30-year silence, they had never truly left her. They had paid a local shopkeeper in secret for years to make sure she always had medicine, telling him never to reveal the source. They had been the silent ghosts, protecting her from the shadows while they built their empire. They wanted her to stay in the streets, not out of cruelty, but because they knew the moment they officially returned, her safety would require the kind of success they only recently fully secured. As the night of 1,000 lights wore on, the 5 brothers took off their expensive suit jackets and rolled up their white sleeves. They didn't sit in the back of their Land Cruisers. They sat on the dirt ground at their mother's feet, just like they did when they were children. The contrast was the ultimate killer hook for any viewer. 5 of the wealthiest men in the country, sitting in the dust, eating from simple plates, surrounded by the people who once hated them. They had turned a graveyard of hope into a festival of life. But as the lights blazed, the eldest brother looked at the architectural plans pinned to the car. He knew that the celebration was just the beginning. The shocking part was over, but the legacy was just starting. Tomorrow, the bulldozers would arrive, not to destroy, but to build a kingdom that would ensure the name Kadadiatu Kulibali would be carved into the history of the streets forever. The morning after the night of 1,000 lights did not bring the usual silence of a forgotten slum. Instead, it brought the thunderous roar of progress. By 7:00 a.m., the dusty street was no longer just a road. It was the most active construction site in the country. But this wasn't a corporate takeover. It was a mission of love. The 5 brothers stood in a line, their white sleeves rolled up, looking at the care center not as a ruin, but as the cornerstone of a new civilization. The neighbors watched from their doorsteps, eyes wide, as a fleet of yellow bulldozers and heavy machinery arrived, escorted by the 5 white Land Cruisers. However, the first shocking move the brothers made was to halt the machines. They didn't tear down the old beige building. Instead, the eldest brother brought in a team of specialized heritage architects. "This building is holy ground," he told them. "You will not destroy these walls, you will reinforce them. You will encase them in a temple of glass, so that for the next 100 years, people can see where a mother's love saved 5 lives." The blueprint of hope was far more than just a renovation. The brothers began the total neighborhood restoration. They hired every able-bodied man and woman on the street who had been unemployed for years. They didn't just bring in outside contractors. They gave the streets the tools to build their own success. The men who once sat idly on corners were now being paid 3 times the city's average wage to lay the bricks of their own future. Within weeks, the dust began to settle as the road was paved with high-durability interlocking stones, the kind you see in the luxury districts of Dubai or New York. The direct sunlight that once punished the neighborhood was now harnessed by thousands of high-efficiency solar panels installed on every rooftop. But the centerpiece was the Kadadiatu Medical Wing. One of the white SUVs was permanently stripped of its luxury interior and fitted with state-of-the-art life support systems, becoming the neighborhood's first mobile ICU. The brothers didn't just build a clinic, they built a legacy. They flew in specialist doctors from Europe and Asia, not to treat the rich, but to provide free health care for every homeless soul that wandered into the district. The most shocking part of Part 7 isn't the buildings, it's the people. The streets were no longer a place of shame. The neighbors who used to hide their faces now walked with their heads held high. They started calling the area the Garden of Return. The 5 brothers had successfully erased the shock of their wealth and replaced it with the security of their presence. Kadadiatu sat in her black wheelchair, watching the glass walls rise around her old home. She wasn't just a resident anymore, she was the queen of the district. Every worker who passed her bowed their head. Every child who received a free book from the new school stopped to kiss her hand. The homeless boys had done the unthinkable. They had turned a place of shocking poverty into a global model of success. But as the final glass pane was lowered into place over the original care center sign, the eldest brother turned to his siblings. "The buildings are done," he whispered, "but the world still doesn't know the full secret of how we made it. Tomorrow, we tell the truth." The dust had finally settled, but the world was still shaking. The story of the 5 homeless boys and their shocking return had gone from a local whisper to a global phenomenon. Reporters from every major network were now lining the streets of the Garden of Return. Their cameras pointed at the gleaming glass structure that now encased the original weathered beige care center. But the 5 brothers didn't care about the cameras. They cared about the woman who sat in the center of it all. On the final day of the project, with the 5 white Land Cruisers parked in a perfect semicircle like a crown of steel, the eldest brother stepped up to a microphone. The entire neighborhood was silent. The streets were now paved, The success was visible in every brick, and the shock had turned into a deep communal pride. "People ask us," he began, his voice echoing with a depth that only 30 years of struggle can produce, "how 5 boys with no names, no money, and no hope could return like this. They look at our suits and our cars and think the secret is money. But they are wrong." He turned and looked at Kadadiatu, who sat in her wheelchair, her silver hair glowing under the direct sunlight, her face radiating a peace that transcended the world. "The secret wasn't the money we made," he continued. "The secret was the debt of love. We didn't work for ourselves. Every time we wanted to quit, every time we were hungry in a foreign land, we didn't see our own empty stomachs. We saw her empty plate. We didn't see our own exhaustion. We saw her tired eyes. The world calls us successful, but we are just 5 sons who refuse to let a mother's sacrifice be in vain." Then the brothers did something that no one expected, the final unthinkable act of the story. They didn't just stay to manage the foundation. They announced that they were stepping down from their corporate roles in the city to move back to the streets permanently. They didn't want to be absentee billionaires. They wanted to be present sons. They converted the top floor of the new medical facility into a home for all of them. The 5 white SUVs were no longer used for their business meetings. They were handed over to the community as a permanent mother's transport service. Any woman in the region who needed help, any child who was found on the streets, would be picked up in a luxury Land Cruiser and brought to the Kadadiatu sanctuary. They turned the symbol of wealth into the ultimate tool of service. As the sun began to set on this final chapter, casting a deep orange glow over the glass-enclosed care center, Kadadiatu did something she hadn't done in years. With the help of her 5 sons, she stood up from her black wheelchair. For a brief, miraculous moment, she stood on her own 2 feet, supported by the strength of the 5 men she had saved from the gutter. The image was iconic. It was the success of the human spirit. The streets had not broken her. They had prepared her for this moment. She looked at the neighborhood, now clean, safe, and thriving, and then at her sons. Her mission was complete. She had taken 5 nothing boys and turned them into 5 everything men. The screen fades to a soft focus on the original faded care center sign, now safe behind its protective glass. This story isn't just about 5 boys and a mother. It is a mirror for all of us. It asks the question, who helped you when you were nothing, and what have you done for them since you became something? The shocking return of the 5 homeless boys proves that the greatest investment you can ever make isn't in stocks, real estate, or gold. It is in people. Specifically, in the people everyone else has given up on. Because when you give a homeless person a home in your heart, they might just come back one day and build a kingdom for you. If this story moved your soul, if you believe that a mother's love is the most powerful force on earth, then don't just watch this, share it. Let the world know that the streets are just a starting point, and success is only real when it brings you back to those who never left your side. The 5 white cars are still there. The 5 suits are still there. But most importantly, the love is still there. From the streets to success and finally, to home. If you believe a mother's love can change the world, hit that subscribe button and share this video to honor the woman who never gave up on you. Comment loyalty below if you would return for the person who saved you.